Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Understanding App Store Payments and Accounting chat. I'll kind of dilly-dally a little bit. I see quite a few people already here, but do like to give folks a few minutes to trickle in. Wanted to introduce Ariel. He is the CEO and co-founder with your brother, right? Of AppFigures.
Yes, that is
And
correct.
Ariel, so I've known Ariel since, 2009. I started
Yeah,
my app
probably.
company in 2008 and was beating my head against the reporting from Apple and found AppFigures very early. So I was probably among your first, hundreds of customers, thousands of customers. I think I maybe have even been on your beta or something. But anyways, why don't you
That's very
introduce
possible.
yourself and tell us a little bit about AppFigures?
Oh, I would love to. So first, thank you for having me. I've known David for so long, and I've wanted to do something like this for so long. So it's good to actually do it. And for those of you who do know me, hi, Ariel from App Figures, and that's how I go on YouTube. But for those of you who don't, my name is Ariel. I co-founded App Figures way back in the day when the App Store just started. It was kind of the end of 2008, actually, launched
Yep.
in 2009, with the idea of we're developers, we need to understand how our business is doing. And that was back when data was not easily accessible, and there was only a little bit to begin with. So I hacked together this thing over the weekend, and I liked it so much, and I showed it to other people. I'm like, oh, can we have access to this? Like, we need this. So I said, sure, let's build a platform out of it. Built a platform, and the goal from day one, between me and my brother, we like to solve problems, and we like to connect the dots. We believe information is how you make better, more informed decisions, information and informed. And so over the years, that's kind of been our goals. How do we give you all the dots so you can connect them and help you connect them? It started with easy analytics, and now we have very complicated analytics. We make it easy. We track pretty much everything that you can see in App Store Connect and in Google Play, and then overlay a ton of data on top of it. So we bring in data that isn't in App Store Connect, like your reviews, so you can respond to them and do everything that needs to happen on that side. We have a whole new suite of App Store optimization tools that's been a huge, huge way for developers to get more visibility on the App Store and on Google Play without having to pay for ads. And recently, we also introduced a suite of app intelligence tools that give you the ability to kind of understand what's going on in the market. I think understanding your competition is such an important tool in the arsenal of growing and making more money and getting more downloads on the App Store. And there was really no solution for this. Either was like way crazily expensive or requires just abusing all of your privacy. And we do neither. Pretty inexpensive, honors privacy. And that's me in a nutshell. I also do a lot of YouTube videos and a lot of content that explains how to use all these things and how to turn them into more downloads and money.
Well, that was a great introduction. Thank you. And most of y'all know Revenue Cat. You probably came here from an email sent by us, so I won't do quite as long an intro. But Revenue Cat is the subscription platform built for mobile apps. So and a lot of people probably are a little confused, like AppFigures, Revenue Cat, don't y'all compete? Like you both have dashboards, you both like analyze the data. We don't actually. I mean, I guess there's like some small overlap in our product. But so with Revenue Cat, we actually provide the SDK inside the app to manage transactions. And then by being part of that chain, one, we make it so much easier. Like in my personal apps, I used to have, and don't hate me, but I used to have in-app receipt validation, which is just a terrible idea and was so buggy, which is how I ended up at Revenue Cat. I ended up there as a customer first and then eventually joined. But by being part of the transaction, we do, server-side receipt validation. It seems like, oh, well, that's super easy. What else does Revenue Cat do? Well, we have a ton of great integrations. So you can send data to attribution providers, to analytics like Mixpanel and Segment and Amplitude and others. And then some of the other stuff that's super cool is that because we're handling the server side, we get near real-time data on people turning off auto renew, on subscriptions going into grace period, which we'll talk about here in a sec. And so we're able to push those to CRM tools like Iterable and Braze and some other tools like that. And so We have charts where you can understand your data. And again, because we have transaction level data, our charts look a little different than Ariel's charts. Because we're actually dealing with the transaction level data. We also are great for customer support teams because we can actually show an individual user's entire history. So customer support teams love us because they can actually dig into and find what's been going on with renewals and cancellations and things like that at an individual user basis, and so much more. Most of you already know Revenue Cat, so I won't go on and on. But did just
I'll
want
add
to
a tiny thing to that. A tiny thing to that. There are what, 70 or 80 different events at this point that Apple is producing for subscriptions. So just doing this in any way that isn't through a platform just makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
No sense.
And then managing it cross-platform. So we support the App Store, Play Store, Amazon Store, Stripe on the web, and we've actually got a few more web payment providers that we'll be integrating soon. So kind of become that one single source of truth for your subscription data. So enough pitching. You guys want to hear about about App Store accounting. So in preparing for this, I actually learned a ton. So Ariel and I both have done deep dives into App Store accounting for 14 years now, ever since the very beginning of the App Store, and we're both still learning new things. So if you feel lost, we're both experts in this and learn new things this week. So we're going to try and summarize it all, and we'll probably have to do another one next year because things will change. But let's dive into transactions on the App Store. So on the surface, you would think, oh, it's simple, like a customer pays and then eventually Apple pays you. Yeah, what's so hard about that? Well, here are all the steps along the way and all the different ways that that can go wrong, and then all the ways that that's going to screw up your accounting. So the first thing is, after a customer pays, the transaction doesn't actually go in immediately. Like if you're at a gas station, your credit card's going to get charged immediately. Apple actually puts transactions into a pending state and tries to bundle them. And this is back from the, App Store was built on top of iTunes infrastructure, and iTunes didn't want to pay 30 cents per transaction to the credit card processors. And so what they smartly did was like, well, if you're buying one song, maybe you're going to buy a couple of more. And so they waited to actually charge the card until they could accumulate multiple transactions. So still to this day, 20 years after the iTunes Store originally launched, with that as the reason for doing it, Apple still will delay transactions and try and bundle them. So first step is even if the customer pays, the credit card might not actually get charged immediately. Then you can branch out from there into Apple actually settling the transaction, which is hopefully, and probably 80% of the time, what happens is that it does actually get settled within 24, 48 hours. And an interesting thing there, that pending period can cross over fiscal months. It can cross over calendar months. So a payment in one fiscal month actually gets settled in the next fiscal month. So there's all kind of straddling that then is a mess accounting wise. And then, of course, the transaction can fail if somebody doesn't have enough on their App Store prepaid account, if they have a debit card, if their credit card's maxed out, if bad number, expired card. I mean, there's a ton of reasons why the transaction can actually fail. Apple has gotten really good about retrying those transactions. And then there's specifically a grace period that you can enable in App Store Connect, where Apple will continue to retry. And I thought that was only 14 days, but we'll talk later that it can actually go, I think, 40 plus days from when the customer pays to when the transaction actually gets settled, because Apple just keeps trying and then waiting and then trying and then waiting. So you kind of get in this loop. Now, eventually, if it is something like an expired credit card where they can't get the updated information or something, you will have canceled transactions. So now you have a payment that customer paid, you've granted them access, and then at some indeterminate point in the future, the transaction actually doesn't go through. And so that transaction is canceled. The revenue that showed up on your daily report, the revenue that we tracked at Revenue Cat, goes away. And then for the transactions that do make it through this journey, which again, it's a surprising number that do end up in this grace period loop. But for the ones that are settled, Apple sets aside taxes, and Google does very similar things. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail. Ariel's kind of the expert on Google. I'm been way more focused on Apple side of things, so I'll talk about Apple more. And then refunds get deducted. So, if you do have a transaction that failed, that gets pulled out. If somebody refunds, that gets pulled out. If there's a chargeback, that gets pulled out. There's all sorts of kind of, as you would expect, running any business, some of that money gets pulled out of what's accruing in your in Apple's bank account. And then currency conversion doesn't happen until the day of payment. And so this whole long perilous journey, it is sitting in Apple's bank account in whatever currency it was paid in. So if you made a sale in the UK, it's in British pounds. It's in an Apple bank account in Ireland, I believe, in British pounds. And then eventually, if you meet the payment threshold, and there are still payment thresholds, I thought those had gone away, but you can, I don't know all the details. They changed.
Now it's the aggregate that is where you look at the sum, not each individual region.
Right. And so in the US, it's something like 3 cents now, right? It's like they'll pay you pretty much almost anything. And but then there's a lot of other countries where it has to be over $150 for them to make a payment. So most of us here talking will probably meet the payment threshold. One question I had for you, Ariel, is it a per country, or is it the total aggregate where, let's say you made $5 in Mexico, but you made $10,000 in the US, you don't hit the payment threshold for Mexico, right? They'll just pay you the $105 total.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, because the way they had it, if you're like way back in the day, they had, I want to say like 3 or 4 regions around the world where they were doing all this collection with the WW or rest of world getting everything else. And now they have so many, almost every big area gets its own region. So I think they couldn't do that anymore, and they had to make it into an aggregate because it just, otherwise you would never make money because of the way they split it up. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, back when I started back in 2008, it was even more confusing because you would make money and you'd see the reports, and then like in smaller countries, it would just get held for an indeterminate amount of time until you pass that cap. So that's much more simplified. And to get more details, check out Apple's website on that. But again, it's really much less of an issue these days, where most people are going to hit the payment threshold and get the full payment every month. So then once it's gone through this whole journey, you get paid. And we're going to talk through the payment calendar. But from when a customer pays to when you get paid by Apple can be up to 63 days. Actually, no, it can be up to 68 days, because you can have
precision here.
You can have a 35-day fiscal month, and then Apple always pays, except for like 4 exceptions in 14 years, 33 days after the end of the fiscal month. So you could have a January 1st transaction. The fiscal month is 35 days long, and you actually don't get paid. And let's just go ahead and go to that slide. So this is Apple's fiscal month. And this is part of the confusion. I for years kind of beat my head against this wall, and finally a couple of years ago created a color-coded chart to understand this. And so this is a perfect example. January 2022 fiscal month started December 26th. And that's actually Q2. That's the beginning of Q2 for Apple. Now you can run your own fiscal year and own accounting, whatever makes sense for you, but your payments from Apple are going to be aligned to this fiscal calendar. So December 26th, the day after Christmas, people are, have their App Store cards out and are buying your app. you don't get paid if you follow the blue to March 3rd. So the fiscal month of January is 35 days. It ends the 29th of January. And 33 days later, you get paid on Thursday, March 3rd, which is actually yesterday. So I actually just saw that hit my bank account yesterday. uh, and so if we get back to that transaction, again, the customer paid on the 26th, but you're not actually getting paid, and it's sitting in British pounds that entire time. So I've seen a ton of this where, the daily sales are way different than the payment, and some of that has to do with the currency. So, within Revenue Cat, within daily reports, within others, we're doing a best estimate on what the currency conversion rate is currently. But as we all know, currency fluctuates, and so that 68 day span can change a lot. And so it's really important to know, as you're figuring these things out, that those currency conversions can make a big swing in what you actually get paid. And then Ariel, tell us about Google's payment calendar, which is actually nicely much more simple.
Well, it's a calendar, number one. Apple's calendar is basically a bunch of weeks, if you think about it this way. It's a bunch of weeks kind of clumped together in a way that made sense to Apple's investor relations, which is really how all this happened. This is Apple's own fiscal calendar of how they report their earnings. And that's why they have it in a way. It's like the 5-week, 4-week, 4-week. They just made it work with everyone else. But on the Google side, it's a basic calendar, and they basically pay you.
A quick anecdote. I actually heard from somebody who said Apple's fiscal year starts in the holiday quarter because Steve Jobs wanted to start the year on a high, and the holiday quarter was always good for Apple in like consumer land. And so even these little random esoteric things have reasons that date back to like the 80s of why Apple's fiscal year starts in September instead of, like most other fiscal years. So go ahead. So Google's is
well, like everything Apple is so weird and so complicated and has all these different nuances. But if you think about it for long enough, it kind of makes sense. Maybe it's not the kind of sense that we want as developers, but it kind of makes sense, which is always kind of a consistent thread across everything that I see from Apple. Maybe it's not obviously making sense, but if you think about it enough, and that's the same sort of mindset I apply when I do ASO teardowns and keyword teardowns. All these algorithms, all these decisions that Apple makes, they make sense somehow. Just have to figure out how. On the Google side, things are a lot simpler because they don't align this with really anything else that doesn't make sense to normal mere mortals. So they just pay you. It's not always exactly on the date, but you can say that about pretty much everything Google when it comes to getting reports out, when it comes to getting paid. It's always within the vicinity of a few days, but overall, so much simpler. And I think also on the subscription side, it's so much simpler, more basic as far as the data they provide and the tools they offer for subscriptions, as I'm sure you know even more than I do, but it is more simplistic overall. So payments are not different.
Yeah. And does Google work similarly as far as accruing the revenue in the native currency, or do they actually convert on the day into whatever the payment currency is going to be?
I'm pretty sure they convert on the date. So transactions happen because we can get transactional data from Google, unlike what we get from Apple, and we keep track of all of that. We have all that information at the time that we recognize a transaction, and that's almost immediately. So unlike Apple, if there is a refund or a chargeback, like I saw one of the questions in the questions list, those will happen as a separate transaction later, and we'd have to account for it as we do this. The other thing about Apple and Google that's a little bit different, Apple provides data to us, and there's a question also in the questions about how to see all this data. And you can see a bunch of it through Revenue Cat because the transactions come in, but on our end, we track all that data directly from Apple. And so the taxes, the conversion rates, the currencies, and there's a whole slide that explains how we do it because it comes out at different times. There's another slide about that too. But on the Google side, it's really all together. So gross revenue, net revenue, they only really give us one number, one set of data, and that's a transaction. And we derive all of the data out of it. Whereas on the Apple side, we get data broken down, but some of it is also a little bit more hidden. So that's also another difference between Apple and Google, and how much accounting we need to do when we work with both of them, when we get reports from both of them.
Yeah, awesome. And before we get into the detailed reports, I did want to kind of bring up taxes and compliance, because this is a question we get a lot. Now, I'm not a lawyer or an accountant, so you need to talk to a lawyer and an accountant. But for my business that I've run on the App Store for 14 years now, Apple does collect all VAT, sales tax by state in the U.S. They handle compliance globally. So, if I'm selling in Sri Lanka or Mexico or, anywhere in the world, they're making sure that the store is in compliance. There's actually been a lot of stuff recently, like India passed a law where you can't have recurring subscriptions over a certain amount. And so, one, I don't have to think about it as a Revenue Cat customer, because Revenue Cat has figured that out and is part of our SDK now. But then two, I don't have to think about it as an app store with App Store payments, because Apple's going to make sure that they're compliant with all those kind of things. So the caveat here is that if you do start selling on the web with Stripe or Braintree or Adyen, or any of those others, that's where the tax and compliance burden does fall on you. And if you do collect web payments, I would definitely suggest getting a lawyer and an accountant. And there are some SaaS tools through Stripe, and all of these platforms do have some help. But one of the things I've personally really enjoyed running an indie shop where I've never even had an employee, is that I don't have to worry about taxes, compliance, and it's all just handled. Apple collects it, they remit it. As I showed on that first slide, Apple actually pays the taxes out. And so my accounting and compliance side of things has been super simple, which, just to wax nostalgia for a sec, really blew my mind in 2008. I wasn't in tech, I wasn't in software, and I started my app business. And when I started getting these transactions in from all these countries around the world where I wasn't even thinking about, taxes and compliance and language and like all these other things, and my apps were just selling, it like totally blew my mind, how much Apple did handle of all of that. Ariel, it looked like you wanted to chime in.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's a really good point, because there's all these things that as a developer or as a business owner, you need to be considering. Taxes is just one of them. And Apple really makes all of that mostly opaque, I think, to developers, which is good and bad. But at the end of the day, it's mostly good for everyone.
Yeah. And then you were telling me
is trying, not exactly the same, but yeah.
So there's a few caveats with Google, with VAT and some other stuff. So what were you telling me about that?
So let's talk about taxes quickly. And the US taxes are fairly simple. Outside of the US, you have VAT, value added tax, and that's not a concept we're used to. So I think for Europeans, for people outside of the US, it's kind of common sense, whereas here it isn't. But VATs get added on top of pricing in general. So not only does the App Store take care of making all those payments and withholding all that money, they also kind of eat it into the price. So everything makes sense. And you, at the end of the day, as a user, you're downloading a 99-cent app or whatever it is in the local currency. On the Google side, it's not at all like that. So taxes are being added on top of it. And while Apple does do the reporting properly, so in your gross revenue, it will show you data, your revenue with taxes, and in your net revenue, it'll be without taxes, which kind of makes sense, right? Google doesn't. They never really talk about taxes. And Google also has all these like really strange rules where if you ask them very politely to not collect taxes for you, and you give them a good enough reason, they'll stop collecting taxes for you. And because they don't report it correctly, it's really hard to tell what's going on just by looking at those transactions that I was mentioning before. So Apple definitely takes all that headache out. But they also make it opaque enough that for large enough companies who have, all those accountants and financial folks who want access to that data, it's always a little bit more difficult to get access to it. So a good and a bad, depends on where you're sitting.
Nice. Let's talk about the payment reports that we do get, and we'll start with Apple, and then you can dive a little bit into Google. We didn't create slides for Google because I'm so Apple focused, and I'm the one who prepared the slides. But yeah, tell us about the daily and the financial and the payment reports, and why only one is the real source of truth.
So in Apple land, when it comes to reporting, and you want to take Apple's reporting when it comes to money because you want to be as accurate as possible, you don't really get one report that gives you everything you need. On a daily basis, you get a daily list of all the transactions aggregated, and then you have that for a certain amount of time. So that's actually for a whole year of daily reports that you can go back. So you only have some limitation, you only have some limited data ultimately. And then you have some weekly reports and monthly and yearly reports. But that's really all you get on a daily basis. So if you want to run your business, you can't wait. You have to do it on a daily basis. That's what you get. It's mostly almost always good. And we'll look at some numbers in a little bit. They'll give you an idea of what I mean by that. But those are daily reports. We track those, we show those, we include those in emails that we send out. And those are really useful because without them, you'd be completely blind to how your app is performing from a business perspective. But then financial reports come out. And financial reports are what we were mentioning before, where every region where money is collected at the end of Apple's month, they close the books on that month and they give you a list of how much money you made in that particular region. And they do it by region. There's a summary report as well, but ultimately all that data is available by region, not always at the same time, which is very odd, but for the most part, it's at the same time. But that doesn't really have the currency, the exchange rate for that currency that you're getting paid on, like David was saying before. So on a daily basis, you have the actual transactions. On a monthly basis, you have the more accurate financial transactions. So any sort of chargebacks or transactions that didn't clear or transactions that got canceled, all of those kind of move into the financial report. And then later on, you get a payout report, which has how much money Apple actually gave you in the actual currency. So if it's coming from Europe, it will turn in, and you're in the US, it will turn into dollars from all these different countries. But that comes a long time after the month actually even ended. So all those on their own are kind of useful for different purposes. But what if you want to know exactly how much money a specific app made? And I only ask that because the payments report doesn't always have the data the way you want it to be. And because data is split up by regions and it's not really all together, and different reports don't really have all that info, you run into this weird case where you can't actually. So you have estimates from daily reports. You have data by country or by region, I should say, from financial reports. And then you have a lump sum total that is very accurate, but is one. And so we actually created a report that uses all of them together to make sense out of them. And what it does is two things. One, it breaks down the revenue, the absolute actual revenue, what you got paid by app and in-app purchase. If you have those, or for subscriptions, you will have those. But also shows you the differences between what the daily reports say, what the financial reports say, and also what the actual amount that you got in your pocket at the end of the month. And that's what you see on the screen. And that's a report that David's been using for a long time.
Yeah. So actually,
that's how you make sense of all of it.
Before Ariel made this super easy, I was paying my app partners and doing rev share based on the daily reports in app figures. And was talking to Craig Hockenberry, longtime indie developer, part of Icon Factory. He's like, those aren't accurate. I was like, what? He's like, there's a payment report. And so there was this company AppViz, and then I think Craig took over part of it after AppViz abandoned it, and created this tool called
He helped
Bean
them
Counter.
keep afloat.
Yeah. So they had this tool called Bean Counter where I would actually go manually download the payment reports, import them into Bean Counter. It is a Mac app. And then it would process the payment similar to what Ariel now does with app figures. And what I found out was that I was overpaying my partners because the daily reports don't have the refunds, the chargebacks, and the other deductions that would come out of it. And the currency conversions were different. And, they had all of the caveats that we've discussed with the daily reports. And so I had been overpaying my rev shares by thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands over the couple of years until I figured that out.
That's wild.
And so I pulled this report up specifically to show how different it can actually be. I tried to find a month where the variance was high, and this is only $15,000 that was paid out by Apple. If you're talking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a month, the spread can be tens of thousands of dollars, not just $1,000 here. But if you look, estimated is at 12,500 ish. And that is the cumulative amount from the daily reports. The actual is, again, what Ariel was saying from the financial report, is 13,125. That's supposed to be more accurate. But then what Apple actually paid was the 13,243. So, if I'd have paid based on estimated this time, I'd actually would have shortchanged my partners because I actually got paid almost $1,000 more. And so again, this is probably due to transactions that came from the last fiscal month that actually got settled in this month. And so they weren't actually transactions in the daily report, but they got paid in this fiscal month. It can be any combination of all these things that we've discussed, that currency conversion, there may have been a lot of sales in Japan and the yen went up compared to the dollar. There's so many different explanations for why this could be, but this is why the payment report is the only source of truth that you can have for App Store data. And part of the reason we wanted to do this chat with Ariel is that, we get asked a lot at RevenueCat, like, well, can't we use RevenueCat data for our accrual accounting? And we're like, no. We track the transactions in RevenueCat and provide great dashboard business tools. Like you want to know when somebody turns off auto renew. You want to see that trial conversion that happens 7 days later. Like you need actionable business data in real time. And that's what we provide by managing the transactions and having our back end and building, we have some incredible charts. I forgot to put a slide in here with our charts, but we have pretty sophisticated charts that track your change in MRR. We have like all sorts of great tools at RevenueCat to help you make business decisions on a day in, day out basis. But the actual hard financial data that you need to do accounting, again, the payment report, Ariel actually didn't say specifically, but it generally comes out either the day of or the day after payment. And so again,
day of usually.
Yeah. So you have a transaction that happened the first day of a fiscal month, of a 35-day fiscal month. Then you have 33 days after, and then the payment report comes out. So you have 68 days from when a transaction happened to when you have actual accounting level data. And so you can't run your business 68 days in the past. And so that's why, at RevenueCat, we're dealing with the live transaction data and trying to give you as accurate. And it ends up being within, 2-3% of the final accounting data. But we can't give you live accurate accounting data because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist until Apple actually does the currency conversion on that 33rd day after the end of the fiscal month. So yeah, it's a little crazy and a little hard to wrap your head around, but that's just, it is what it is. And I've been using for payments, this report in App Figures for probably a decade now. Wes, the minute Ariel added it to App Figures, I was using it and have used that as my source of truth for accounting. We're going to get
something little to add to that.
Yeah.
So Apple does give you data on subscriptions, and so it's again very different than what you would see with RevenueCat, because RevenueCat has the ability to look at events in a way that makes a lot more sense. But even on the aggregate side, that data exists, and that's what we look at. So that's how we compile those estimates off of subscriptions. But again, that goes back to, they're not exactly on that like down to the penny. So really no one has data down to the penny. And that's because, like you were saying, it doesn't exist. But one of the things that I think is probably even going to catch more people by surprise at the end of this month, when it gets into the payments report, is what's happening in Russia now. And that's going to be a huge change in conversion rate for the ruble, and that's going to be a problem. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah. I did want to leave plenty of time for questions, and we will answer the questions that are in the chat. I wanted to get through these slides quickly, and then we'll get to that. So the financial report that we were just talking about, if you are trying to do, to the penny accounting, especially accrual accounting, or if you need to understand exchange rates and book the difference in revenue and those sorts of things. And this is something I just learned this week. Apple issues a financial report as a in process, a temporary, and that happens in the neighborhood of 30 days after the end of the fiscal month. But then they actually update that report after the payment is made. And that final financial report will, instead of saying estimated proceeds, it will actually say, it'll actually give the payment amount and the payment total and the payment bank. And when you see that payment total and payment bank on that report, you know it's finalized. And if you look at this list of reporting fields, you do actually get data on tax, on adjustments, on withholding, and you get the exchange rate. So this is the report where you can actually go in and country by country figure out, so all the transactions that you do get data on, and we'll get to that in the next report, but you can actually back into an accurate exchange rate once you get the final financial report that has these rates in it. Anything else you wanted to add, Ariel?
Well, the actual conversion rate is also in the payments report, or in the payment report from Apple. So you do eventually get the real amount that they used for that particular region to convert that amount of money, and they show you the before and after, and the after will match what is in your bank account 100%. So you do have that eventually. The question is just when.
Yeah, and then this is the payment report, and this is the report that the AppFigures uses to generate that screen that we just saw before. And this has actually been enhanced a lot in just the last 4 or 5 years. Apple has actually taken a lot of steps in the right direction of giving more data so that we can do more precise accounting. So if you look at this, you have a transaction date, a settlement date, SKU, Apple identifier, you have all this information. And this is the payment report, again, that gets sent once you actually get paid. And this is the report that's actually like penny for penny, exactly what's listed. And they give you every single transaction that happened in that month, including the refunds and other stuff that would make adjustments. And so if you're trying to do transaction level accounting to the penny, this is a report that you need to look at. And we'll go to the next one. This is something that blew my mind. I just found this out like a few weeks ago when I was digging into this. If you download that report, drop it into Excel or whatever, and you create a row or a column for time to settle, and you do the time calculation from transaction date to settlement date, it can take 38 days for a transaction to settle. That's, going back to that very first slide that we were looking at. It seems so simple. Customer pays, you charge the credit card, developer gets paid. So 38 days can span multiple fiscal months. Fiscal months with Apple are either 35 or 28 days. So this could have happened in the January fiscal month, spanned the February fiscal month, and actually settled in the March fiscal month. And so I didn't go through and list the entire spreadsheet, but you have quite a few that have these long transaction time to settle. But then, the bulk of them are settled within 24 to 48 hours. So, these are the exception. But when you're trying to do to the penny accounting, and then especially, and we'll talk about in a sec, accrual accounting, these are the things that really screw with the numbers, is how long it can take. One interesting thing too, and just anecdote, this number 21 here is a paid app, which is why the SKU isn't a typical like in-app purchase SKU. This is one of my paid apps, group text. And I would have never thought that a paid upfront app could take 10 days to settle, but sure enough. So this is an app that somebody, hit the pay button, went through the process, double click the home button or the side button to confirm the transaction. They downloaded, they used the app, and 10 days later is when the money actually left their bank account and hit Apple's bank account on a paid app. And again, the ones above you can see are annual subscriptions, and annual subscriptions with free trials and whatnot. And so this just blew my mind, downloading this detailed financial report and doing some math on it.
One thing that I think not enough people know is that when it comes to credit card transactions, it's not a direct money is coming out of one bank into another at all, especially as it gets to the international level. So money comes out of one bank and goes to another bank that then usually goes to another bank. And it depends on who issued your credit card and the company that is charging your money. So Apple, in that case, the gateway that they use and how they're connected to all the banks. And normally it's not them that are going to clear this transaction. So it has all these hoops to jump through. And when you're thinking international, just multiply that by a bunch. And so you really, the money is jumping from one to another to the point where taking 10 days is like not absurd. It doesn't have to mean that it was something like crazy, like a credit card declined or something like that. But that's probably what it means. But still, it's like, it's so long. But
Yeah.
Apple makes this so invisible, which is so cool. And I run a subscription business that doesn't use Apple's platform for making money. And I don't use Stripe or any of those because when we started, those didn't exist almost 13 years ago. So for us, we built everything from scratch. So we know all these things and we have to deal with all these things. And we have to we are the ones retrying all these transactions. And it's such a huge headache. So having that kind of happen under the hood is so nice.
Yeah.
That
And it's nice that
it's
Apple's
worth
gotten
the 10
better
days.
and better at reporting it as well. Like we're getting more and more
Yeah.
detailed reports so that you can do better accounting. I forgot to ask you earlier, tell us about, because this is going to be news to me, about how Apple handles dates. Like what is a
Oof.
day?
So that's probably one of the most asked questions when people start using us, or when even people who have used us for a long time sometimes don't even know this. But Apple has its own concept of a day. A day is not a 24-hour period globally. And it kind of makes sense. But the idea is that how they charge with different regions being the places where they collect the money, those places get to take their own 24-hour period that becomes their day. The problem is, so for example, in Europe, a day is a day that makes sense in Europe hour-wise, where in the US, it's a day that makes sense in the US hour-wise. Same for Asia, same for other countries. So how do you report multiple different kind of time zones into a single time zone that is not UTC? What Apple does is it takes all those different 24-hour periods and squishes them into one date that does not have a timestamp. So you end up with, for example, today is Friday. The day in Europe is almost ending. The day in Asia already ended. And the day, if you move out west, will be ending. So when Apple reports on today, on the 4th, they will squish all of those. So you're not going to get an actual one line cuts across all the countries that is the deadline for a transaction. And that usually confuses people a lot. And Apple doesn't really explain it. In App Store Connect, they now allow you to look at data through UTC, and that makes things even worse. But ultimately, it is that 24-hour period that gets squished into one. I think it actually makes sense because a day in the if you're thinking about your revenue and or you're making more money in the day or at night, day and night are very different across different time zones. So that's a way of doing it right.
That's
I
fascinating.
can
And
see
so they've always done it
why.
this way, right?
Yep.
It's probably based on how they chose to do their own internal accounting when they started the iTunes store in 2003 or whatever it was.
Well, I mean, that also makes a ton of sense because microtransactions are really a great way to save money on transactions. Otherwise, like
Right.
if you're running Stripe, simple Stripe, basic Stripe out of the gate, you're probably paying 3 and something percent plus a 20 or 30 cent transaction fee on every transaction. So if they had to charge 99 cents with a 30-cent transaction fee, the world's not going to be where it is today, and they
Yeah.
lump them together, and that was a great idea. Today that
Yeah.
gets like done automatically by a whole bunch of aggregators, but back in the day
Right.
that wasn't a thing. So I totally see why this would make sense and save everyone money.
Yeah. Golly. I see. I didn't even know that Apple was aggregating days in that way, which now actually makes a few things make more sense. I should have known that, 14 years in. Um,
We have an
uh,
Algebase article about it. I'll give you a link.
Yeah, thank you. Um, real quick, little breaking, very esoteric news here. Apple is working on a transaction tax report. When I was digging into the docs this week, I found this. Do you have any more details from Apple about what this transaction report is for and going to be, and when it's even going to hit?
Unfortunately, not really.
Okay.
The thing is, Apple rarely says they're going to make something happen. Usually they don't say anything. We might get a hint because we know people who know people, but a
Yeah.
hint, nothing even beyond that. And that's it. So I'm not entirely sure why they have it up there. I'm not entirely sure why that C is not capitalized because it's really hurting my face. But ultimately, this has been probably one of the most requested features from, especially from the larger developers who are paying a lot of money in taxes.
Right.
And there are a lot of different tax regulations that companies now have to worry about, especially as you think about international. And the way Google handles it is by just saying, if you want to take care of it yourself, just go and do it. We're not going to touch it. Brazil is a big country for that. And a lot of game companies are now opting to not let Google handle taxes in Brazil, and they do all the work because it's so complicated. So I think that's the reason behind this coming up. And
Gotcha.
I hope this will be what we're all hoping for. And we can
Yeah.
take this and bring this into our reporting and make that
Right.
payments report make even more sense.
Gotcha. Awesome. And then the last thing I did just want to touch on, and I probably should have touched on this earlier, but part of the reason all of this is a problem is that a lot of companies, especially larger companies, need to do what's called accrual-based accounting. So cash-based accounting, this is how I've run my business, how a lot of businesses run, is that when I get a payment from Apple March 3rd, it is for the January fiscal month, but I record that as revenue on March 3rd. And that money hit my bank account March 3rd. To the IRS, to everyone else, it's money that hit my account on March 3rd. It doesn't matter that it was from January. It just matters that I actually received the money in March. And it's so simple. I mean, I have Zero, the financial SaaS tool set up to automatically import everything. And it takes me like a few hours a year to run all my accounting for tax purposes, because it's all just automated into Zero. And I just do all cash based. I just assign categories to the transactions. It's when the money leaves my account, when the money comes into my account. It's so simple. Now, larger companies need to do accrual-based accounting, which means that you want to record the revenue the day the transaction happened. And so now if you think back again to the very first slide, and then everything we've talked about this whole time, is that if a transaction happened the first day of January's fiscal month, which was actually December 26th, and you didn't have accurate financial data on it until March 3rd, trying to sort that out of what revenue actually transacted on the 26th of December, when that refund actually, if you get a refund, what was that transaction that it's actually related to? And you're having to go back and fix your December books. If you're doing a calendar-based accrual accounting, you're having to fix December's books in March because you don't have accurate data for December 26th until March 3rd. So this is a huge hassle. And I've talked to multiple, large apps. I think there's some folks here in the chat that I've spoken to about this. Apple's making it easier and easier. App Figures and Revenue Cat were both, everybody's exploring ways to help make this a little bit easier. But the bottom line is it's just a huge hassle.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of these big companies end up using our API so they can get all those different columns from the payments report. So they get the estimated, and that's used for just to get an idea of what to expect. And then they bring in those financial reports as soon as they become available at the slightly estimated stage before the conversion rate and everything. That makes more sense. And then at the end, you automate that with the API. So it all comes down with the payments report, and then everything makes sense. But yeah, it's not an easy process. And we work with teams that are built around clarifying this internally in very big organizations. And they really depend on this, because without this, it's really problematic.
Yep. All right. Well, the 15 minutes of slides I prepared took us 50 minutes to go through.
Only 50 minutes.
Ariel and I like to talk, and it is a rather complex topic. And so hopefully we've gone into enough detail, but not completely bored everybody out of their mind. Let's jump right into questions, and I can go over the hour. If Ariel, if you need to bounce on the hour, totally cool. But I'll try and answer as many of these questions as I can as we go through. So start live answer. What happens with chargebacks? Customer cancel a charge via their bank. I'm going to send this one to Ariel.
Oh, I'll take this one. It's easy. The money gets taken from your total. So because what Apple does is they basically build kind of your own money, your own accounting of money. They can take money from that until they pay you. And so they will take that from you and not pay that to you. I believe they have rules around, and they fight chargebacks fiercely. So it's not really as easy to do a chargeback unless it really, really makes sense. But when that happens, they'll just take the money away from you.
And from the accounting side and payment report side, a chargeback is basically treated as a refund, correct? So in the payment report, it'll show up as a refund. And as with other refunds, it gets deducted from and shown in the transaction list in the payment report.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And feel free to ask follow-ups. I'm just going to go through starting from the earliest question and go through, because it is a confusing topic, and we tried to cover everything. How can you see all of those amounts? Meaning, how can I see total settled, tax set aside, refunded amount, currency conversion, net amount? I want to know how I can see the gross amount that relates to the net payment we're receiving. We haven't been able to find this report. So I think we answered that question, and feel free to follow up, but that payment report, so AppFigures will automatically download that and aggregate it for you into that payment report that we showed with my personal data in there. And I didn't bring this out at the time, but I love how AppFigures even has the individual in-app purchases listed. And so Apple does provide at the transaction level and the SKU level data. And so I'm able to see in the AppFigures payment report how much of that payment is coming from my lifetime subscription versus the annual subscription versus the monthly subscription. And those are the hard numbers from Apple in that report. If the level of details in AppFigures report is not enough for you, then what you do, and I did this in the last month preparing for this chat, is that you go in for the first time, because I've been relying on AppFigures for more than a decade to do this for me. You go into App Store
making me
Connect.
blush.
You go into App Store Connect and you download it there, and you get this massive CSV file that you can then, use it like an ETL into a data warehouse if you want to be more sophisticated and do kind of what Ariel's doing, but with your own kind of custom needs. Dump it into Excel and sort and create columns like I did to calculate the time to settle. But that report does have every single transaction listed with that transaction date and then the settlement date. And so this is where, Revenue Cat, we have looked into taking those financial report or the final payment report and normalizing it against our transaction level data. But again, for the reasons Ariel discussed, normalizing those two is probably impossible, because we're getting the time in UTC and trying to match those into the payment report, which just gives you the day they happened instead of like a timestamp for when they happened. It is tough. And then I'll go ahead and answer this. I think somebody asked it later. So the Apple does not send transaction. They send transaction level data, but they don't have any kind of a identifier on that transaction where you can tie that back to the transaction that actually happened. And they do that for privacy reasons. I'm still a little confused about what's so private about the payment data that they couldn't provide some sort of transaction ID that ties it back to the original transaction. But for privacy reasons, they don't let you do that. So again, it's like you can match to the day the original transaction and or like the actual like transaction data to the payment transaction data, but with time zones and all that other stuff, trying to match them perfectly, you're never going to get one-to-one. You could maybe get, oh, well, 28 transactions happened in this day in the UK, and then in the payment report, these 28 transactions happen. But it's yeah, it's going to be difficult to get that to 100%, which is why we haven't built it. And then, of course, App Figures doesn't actually have the transaction data that we developers have, as far as the App Store receipts, and it shows the renewals. And we have all of that data as Revenue Cat, since we manage the transaction and then continually refresh that receipt using Apple's push notifications and then the polling feature. So we have those individual transactions with all the details of all the renewals, of all the grace periods and everything like that. But again, matching that to the actual
you can't tie them to anything.
is a fool's errand at this point.
Yeah,
unless Apple
you can get
gives us
really,
a
really
little more
close.
detail. Yeah,
but close is not good enough when it comes to money. That's where we usually draw the line.
Yep. So Leo asks, for a SaaS subscription business, is there a way to send people to pay on my site and bypass Apple's 30%? Absolutely. So again, as we discussed, you can use Stripe. Ariel runs his business outside of the App Store and can tell you all the challenges of managing all that. Stripe has made it way easier. There's other payment providers, Braintree and others. There's whole other webinars we've done and blog posts about this. Apple does have very specific rules around what who you can send off the App Store. So it's possible. And RevenueCat, again, we actually provide SDKs to do that with Stripe, and then we have other payment providers upcoming. But for all the reasons we discussed, and I know I'm like, probably think I'm super biased being from RevenueCat, but with Apple managing the taxes, the withholdings, the compliance, and everything else, and then also it being so easy for them to just use their face to pay, I think people really underestimate just how much of a conversion rate drop you're really going to have pushing people to web payments. And even if it was inside the app with a credit card, it's just a different ball game. But I will say Stripe is actually going deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole. They acquired a company that does tax reporting. They don't yet collect and remit payments, but I can imagine that might not be too far off. So I think over time, this is going to get easier and easier. And one of the things that I'm kind of droning on at this point, but it's just such an important topic. But as Ariel was talking about just a few minutes ago, when he started in 2009, you think, oh, it's so easy. Like you just collect payments and just, Stripe on their website, it's just like 2 lines of code to collect the payment. It's so easy. Even to this day, Stripe makes things so much easier. Braintree makes things so much easier. But they don't solve everything end to end. And they even don't solve some of the accounting things end to end the way Apple and Google do. And again, Apple probably better than Google these days. But if you are going to collect on the web, just be prepared to either be knowingly, breaking local laws in some regions, or find SaaS.
You didn't hear this from us.
Yeah, I mean, I was just say, it's up to you. So talk to a lawyer, talk to an accountant, and if you're collecting on the web, use something like Stripe, and then there are tools in Stripe that you can use to help make some of this more simple as well. But it is a big hairy mess. Do you have anything to add, Ariel?
I mean, we can talk about this for days, this
I
particular topic. And
know.
we just added an integration with Stripe for the exact same reason, because we see
Yeah,
more developers are trying now this. And with everything that's been happening with Apple over the last almost year, it's inevitable that Apple will open up to Stripe. But now it's nearly impossible. Only a few different apps can do it, and under like really crazy conditions. And I've covered that on my various live streams of the potential that really doesn't exist, in my opinion, with that. But it has to change. I give it
yeah.
12 to 18 months and we'll see a big shift, and then it will become possible. Hopefully by then Stripe will have some solution that is a little bit more tailored for these kind of use cases, which I know that they're working on.
Yep. All right. Rachel asks, for sub-transaction data sent by Apple, do they have the practice of revising data retroactively? Yes. Go ahead.
Absolutely. The thing is, so we look at a lot of data from a lot of developers, small, big, and everything in between. And for the most part, they don't change the data retroactively. But once in a while, we'll find something that makes absolutely no sense, triggers all the alarms on our end as far as data stability. And we'll talk to developers, be like, this makes no sense. I didn't do anything. And I see this like massive increase or massive drop. And that happened, I want to say, in the beginning of February. There was a day that was just a huge dip for everyone. And we talked to Apple about it, and they got it fixed. So it doesn't happen too often. And when it does, Apple is really good about fixing it. But it does happen from time to time.
This is what I'm curious about. So like at Revenue Cat, since we are dealing with the transaction level data and we're refreshing the receipts, if a transaction had gone into a grace period and then actually failed, 10 days later or whatever it is, that transaction gets updated in our database, and it has the entire chain from starting a free trial to the Apple trying to convert the free trial to going into the grace period to everything. In Apple's daily reports and then in the subscription data, they do give you what happens when somebody is an active subscriber for 10 days while that transaction is pending, and then they actually aren't a subscriber anymore. Does Apple, and maybe this is part of this question, is does Apple retroactively consider them no longer a subscriber, or never having been a subscriber, or are they a subscriber for those 10 days and then they is almost like a cancellation? Do you know how that works?
Yeah, so that gets extremely complicated, but actually works kind of well. So Apple under the hood has all these different classifications for where an active subscriber is in that long kind of flowchart that you had before, except for subscriptions, it gets even more complicated. We're tracking, I want to say at this point, 70 or 80 different of those labels, and that's all the ones that Apple has. Some of those are not at all documented. So we had to figure out what they all mean. And one of those labels, or a few of those labels, have to do with the specific state when a credit card declined or when a transaction wasn't possible. And so they'll go into a billing retry, and then from there they'll go into grace, and then from there they'll kind of walk through a whole process. So you can see on our side all these different numbers and how much of your user base is actually in a retry period or is in a grace period. And you can see if they moved into grace from a trial. So if a trial was supposed to upgrade and it didn't. So you have all this data. It's just so much that most people don't care enough about it because it's usually a tiny percentage. So we have what we call calculated metrics that lump all of them. So we'll lump people who we know are in this process of getting retried, and we know that they're still technically active. So they're getting access from the app point of view. And so those will remain active. And then when that changes, when that clock hits, they'll become a cancellation.
Gotcha.
And then they'll get out of the calculated metric. So under the hood, it's broken down to a bazillion pieces.
Yeah.
On top, you only see what is easy. And you can
Gotcha.
see both on
That
our
makes sense.
side. Most of our users don't dig as deep for obvious reasons.
And then again, on the Revenue Cat side, because we have that at a per user level, where we have it both server side with the user ID, but then also client side, you can actually, with our SDK, pull the state they're in. And if they are in a grace period or if they're in a trial, you can, put a little flag up there saying, hey, there's trouble with your payment, and explain how to fix it. You can send a push notification, saying, hey, your trial is going to expire because your transaction is in the grace period. So you can actually, in near real time, be able to kind of trigger these win backs at an individual user basis. A lot of people use email for that as well. And so with a tool like Iterable, you can take that grace period webhook and then fire off some kind of win back on that, since we do have that customer level data. So I think we've answered this question pretty well. So Google pays in 30 days. That's one of the questions. Google pays in 15 days, correct?
Yeah. So they'll pay within that area, I would say. So in less than 30 days would probably be a very safe way to look at it.
Gotcha. In their docs, they say they pay on the 15th after the end of each calendar month. So the 15th of every month, which is so much more simple, like we showed in that calendar. But you're saying that sometimes it's the 17th, sometimes it's the 18th, sometimes did they ever pay the 13th or 14th? It just kind of drifts?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It usually is a little bit later, but you can expect it around the 15th. Gotcha. From what I've seen.
One of the things I've been surprised at with Apple is that they always pay exactly 33 days after the end of the fiscal month. And because I have the data, and because so I actually went back and looked at all my bank transactions, and I have a blog post where I give the specific dates where this happened, but I believe there's only been 5 times in the history of the App Store where Apple didn't pay exactly on the 33 days. I think 2 or 3 of them were due to that day landing on a holiday. And then a couple of them, I swear, I think Apple does a little bit of financial engineering here and there, where they pushed a payment into the next fiscal year to bump their services revenue in the next fiscal quarter instead of the current fiscal quarter. So it just blows my mind that in 14 years of payments now, there's only been 4 or 5 times, just a handful of times, that Apple hasn't paid exactly 33 days after the end of the fiscal month.
Apple does a lot of financial engineering.
It's
so clever. It's so clever.
One of the things about it. I actually tweeted about this recently, and you and I had a chat on this on Twitter. So I published our blog post in the fall about Apple's 2022 fiscal year. And then in January, somebody pings me on Twitter and they're like, hey, your fiscal calendar's wrong. I was like, no, it's not. I've done this multiple years. I've watched the fiscal calendar for a decade now. It was right. I'm like, no, it's wrong. And so I think somehow you got tagged in the conversation, or I asked you about it. And turns out in December, Apple updated their fiscal calendar. So what was going to happen, Apple's fiscal year only has 364 days or 360 days or something like that, because of the way they do 28-day and 35-day fiscal months. And so every 5 to 6 years, they have to add a whole week to realign the calendar. So the end of fiscal 2022 is September 24th, which is really awkward. And so to realign the fiscal calendar to the monthly calendar, Apple has to add a week every 5 or 6 years, which is bizarre. Mm-hmm. So the original 2022 fiscal calendar had an extra week in the December fiscal month. And my guess and is that it was financial engineering, because they had such a strong quarter and they knew they were going to have such a good quarter that they pulled that fiscal month out of December, and they're going to add it back to next December. So the fiscal 2023 December will likely have 5 weeks in the fiscal month instead of 4. I'm going to follow up on this in 2023, because it's going to be interesting to see what their services revenue does year over year. It's something a lot of financial analysts don't even pay close attention to, of how Apple can shift revenue around with these fiscal weeks and the fiscal months and the payment dates and things like that.
I don't know if that was what they did this year, because there's an actual pattern if you look at it over years, and that's how we discovered that. So they had a calendar in App Store Connect that was just wrong. And when we discovered it, we asked a bunch of different people at Apple about it, but at the same time,
Yeah.
we put out our own with the dates we thought were right. And they have a pattern for when they add that extra week, and that pattern matched to next year, not to this year. So
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe it's like commodified financial engineer or like templated financial engineer, like something was, I don't know, but
Yeah.
it
And
kind of
it,
fit a template.
from a
So to
calendar
me, it
standpoint,
makes sense.
it actually makes sense to do it in 2023 as well, because it lands perfectly on January 1st, starting the
Yep.
2023 Q2. So it does make sense calendar wise, but it was just weird how that all went down. Like, how
Yeah,
does Apple
maybe.
post the wrong fiscal calendar? And what funny
I
thing
mean,
is,
it's
I
App
actually
Store Connect. I don't know. It's one of those places they pay less attention to, I think.
maybe. Yeah. Anyways, we can. I don't think anybody wants to hear us debate the financial engineering. Let's move on to questions. Start
Well,
live
I'll
answer
invite you
with.
to my live stream to do that. We'll do
Okay,
that
we
later.
should. That'd be fun. Simon asks, revenue cat charts don't handle VAT well. Will that be fixed? I know it's something we're looking into, and if you take the context of this entire conversation, you probably understand why it is actually very challenging to handle these things well. So you are absolutely correct. We don't handle VAT well, and it's something we're trying to solve. But given all these complexities, it is a challenge. So I can't promise when it will be solved. But we're aware, and wish it were easier to handle this better. Dylan, we're running a paywall A/B test with Amplitude. However, we can't compare the refund rate because RevenueCat does not send the refund event to Amplitude, right? We do actually. Why don't you get with me or our support team offline, and we can talk. I don't know all the details of exactly how it does, but it does. Let's email me directly or jump on our community and tag me, and we'll get this answered for you. Next one. We're getting a lot of revenue cat questions today. But I mean, this is part of why we're doing this webinar, is that like it is really confusing all the different financial aspects of what we handle versus what gets paid. Why do some revenue cat users auto renew with the price of $0? Does it mean they have a subscription for free? I never offered a subscription at that price. That's another question for our community. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure there's a reason, but I don't have the answer off the top of my head. Glenn asks, can you actually see the currency conversion that Apple uses? As far as I see, you just get the transactions in the local currency and the payment reports. So we covered that one earlier. Apple does eventually. It's just that since they don't convert it until the payment date, they can't give you that data until they actually have data and have actually converted the revenue. Bryce asks, with this report that you are showing, where can I see the detail? This is still showing the net revenue. Where did you see the gross amount? So again, we got to this later, I think, is that the payment report is where you get the transaction level data for the entire penny accurate. And again, it just doesn't come out until the 33 days after the end of the fiscal month. Daniel asks, there seems to be a catch up every 3 months for actual revenue on the App Store. What drives that? This is the fiscal month, and this is what's so confusing. And when I was solely reliant on App Store revenue for paying the bills, I love Apple's 35-day fiscal months because you make more money. What's I don't know off the top of my head the exact percentage difference between 35 days and 28 days, but you get a whole extra week of revenue in those months. And so it's not a catch up. It's just that their payments are for a 35-day month instead of a 28-day month. And again, if you check into, if you happen to use App Figures, you see that data in the payment report, and then you can use our calendar or Ariel's calendar to kind of match up where those payments are coming from.
I should add that the payments report has a calendar built in. So when you ask for the May report, for example, you get the actual fiscal May report. You don't have to do any of that kind of ninjaing around that. We
doing the
also give
math.
you the ability to look at the financial reports by the month that Apple has, which is a regular calendar month for those financial reports in the sales report. So you can do that too and then align them, which is what happens in payments by default. If you want to go really crazy, you can
Really
download
crazy.
those reports directly from the archive, which will give you what you would get if you had to go into App Store Connect and then drop them into Excel and start having fun. But I don't know who wants to have fun on Excel on a Friday evening. So if you do,
No.
it's possible.
Is it possible to get payment in euro instead of pounds? Do you know that, Ariel?
Not off the top of my head, but I think that's more of what Apple decides based on your bank, right?
Yeah, I think it's that you would need to set up a bank in the eurozone to be able to accept euros instead of pounds. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and like I set up a U.S. account, and I've always been paid in dollars. And so, yeah, it depends. This may get complicated though, because if you're registered as a UK entity and pay taxes as a UK entity, they might not actually allow you to set up a euro denominated bank account. But so that would actually be a good question for Apple's. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that Apple's support on this kind of stuff, it can take a while to hear from them, but they actually do have decent support if you ask these kind of questions and say, hey, I'm in the UK, but I want to get paid in euros, is that possible? You will likely get a good answer of how to actually do that. But my guess is that it's going to be tricky if you're a UK entity. Doug asks, does detailed financial reports show every transaction as you said, or is it consolidated? It does show every transaction. The nice thing is it shows every transaction, but you do have a column for SKU so that you can, as AppFigures does, actually tabulate individual SKU level totals and then total all the SKUs up for the app totals. Kelly, jumped around. Kelly asks, why doesn't Apple enable individual transaction IDs that would allow transactional level reconciliation? There is no solution for this issue. And I mean, I have talked to Apple directly about this, and the answer was privacy. It doesn't make sense to me because, Revenue Cat, we have all this data at a user level. Like if you're running a business and you have customers, you need to know that customer. And like, when I buy something online and I give them my home address and my credit card, they have my home address and credit card. That's not a privacy invasion. That's necessary to transact and do business with a business. And so
Safely.
At Revenue Cat, we have, because we manage the transactions inside the app, we facilitate that and have the transaction level data. And then by updating those receipts server side, we have every single thing that's happened. So we know, again, if it's gone into grace period, we know at an individual user basis. So when your support team is talking to somebody who says, hey, why am I not getting access? They can actually pull up by email, or we can also use anonymous IDs. And there's a little hack, because I like to keep things anonymous and I don't collect email, although I probably should start collecting email. But there's a little hack you can put in your app in the settings where, using the Revenue Cat SDK, you can actually grab that anonymous ID. So when they start a support request, you can grab that anonymous ID, and then you can search that anonymous ID in Revenue Cat and actually get the transaction level data and see, oh, they went into a billing grace period and then it failed and they just need to go back into the App Store and renew. And so it's like, and this is not like massive privacy invasion. This is like, you're doing business with a company that needs to know whether you've paid or not, and needs to know the status of your transaction, and needs to know that on a user level basis so that they can grant you permission to use it. So that's another thing Revenue Cat does as well, is that we have what we call an entitlement engine. And so when somebody pays, you can use the Revenue Cat SDK to determine what level of access they get. In some of my apps, I have multiple in-app purchases in addition to the subscription. And so with the RevenueCat SDK, you can grant those individual features individually when they've paid on those, and then when they get refunded, you can take them away. When they're a subscriber, they get access to this. When they're a lifetime user, they get access to that. And so it's like, this is data you need to have. It's not some massive privacy invasion. And so I guess the only thing that I can the only thing I can think is that if somebody's using a VPN because they want like absolute privacy, the payment report will give you their state. So like you could know the state they live in. And so, but yeah, it is definitely a source of frustration, both for Ariel, obviously, and then especially for us at RevenueCat, because we would love to be able to tie our transactions to the payment data directly. But Apple, for privacy reasons, doesn't allow that to happen.
Well, like a tiny thing to add on top of it is all the way up until subscriptions, it wasn't that necessary. Like you'd want it because that's how you make better decisions, and that's how I understand the life cycle a little bit better. But with subscriptions, you absolutely need it. It's no longer a matter of just, oh, it would be nice to have. And so I think eventually maybe we'll get a little bit more from Apple. They're a little bit slow when it comes to these sort of things, so give it some time. But they've really upgraded and updated a lot of the infrastructure related to subscriptions a ton over the last like 2 or 3 years. The types of data that they've been giving us have really expanded. We started with maybe 10 or 15 different those labels that I was talking about before, those metrics, and now we're up to 70 or 80. It's possible it's even more. Yeah. So I imagine we'll see more of this in the future.
Yeah,
I don't know when. I'm looking forward to it though.
Someday, hopefully. 14 years in, we're still like crossing our fingers, hoping Apple like gets their stuff together.
I don't know. I'm super excited about the last couple of years in the App Store. So much.
No, they really have
stuff
been moving.
Has changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a renaissance in a way of things. So who knows?
Yeah. So then Carlos asks, and this is a valid point as well. So RevenueCat data is 2 to 3% off from the payment report if it's primarily US based. If you have more VAT customers, again, it's because we aren't properly in RevenueCat handling VAT. And again, something we're working on. So the answer is yes, we're aware, and we're working on it. Camilo, what happens with payments when Apple decides to terminate your developer account? Do you have any experience with this, Ariel? Have you worked with any customers who
directly? I've heard from a few. It's never good though.
Yeah.
It's never good. It depends why they terminated the account. It's always a matter of why. Apple doesn't really do anything shady. It all has to apply according to some sort of rule that they have in the developer agreement. So it really depends. If they decided that you were defrauding them in some way or doing something that goes against the terms, then all of those downloads technically go against the terms. So you're never going to see that money. In most cases, you don't see that money. But again, it really depends on why it was terminated.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've always been curious, like all these apps that get pulled from the App Store for fraud and stuff. Anecdotally, I've heard they don't automatically do a lot of refunds, and that's tricky because a lot of it has already been paid out. But if they terminate an account and don't make the final payment, I would hope they at least refund that, and Apple doesn't just keep it as part of like some kind of a slush fund. Yeah.
From what I know, they really operate the same way across the board. So when an app is pulled, that's where it ends.
Well,
that's what I think.
And it's another one where I guess we need to find somebody who's had and I guess if anybody here knows somebody, put them in touch with me or Ariel.
I would love to know.
Yeah, I would love to talk to somebody who's been through this experience and find out, if there's refunds done and if you get a final payment and those kind of things. And like Ariel said, that's probably different depending on why you're terminated. So if you know somebody who's been terminated for a cause, that would be especially interesting. And Ariel, if you need to jump, I mean, I want to try and,
I'm still with you. I got a few more minutes.
All right. We do accrual accounting here. I was wondering, does Apple charge the card on time of transaction and pay us later, or do they actually charge the card later after the transaction date? And that kind of It's a very frustrating answer that we talked through in multiple ways during the presentation, but the answer is that, yeah, it's indeterminate from the transaction happening and when Apple actually charges the credit card, and for dozens of reasons that things can get delayed. Jonathan asks, it sounds like most smaller app companies are using cash basis accounting. Is that correct? If so, is there a revenue threshold at which SaaS companies will cross over to accrual accounting? Is it hard to make the switch from cash basis to accrual basis? I've always operated cash basis. I've recommended it to everybody I talk to. Again, I'm not an accountant. I'm not a lawyer. I shouldn't give this advice publicly, but it is just simpler. And so, do you know, Ariel, like what are the specific reasons a larger, I guess, publicly traded companies are pretty much forced to do accrual-based accounting. So a company that's headed toward becoming public, a company that needs their accounting to be that way for specific reasons. Yeah, can you speak to that more, Ariel?
Yeah, so I'll preface it with I'm not an accountant or a lawyer or anything of that nature, but you don't have to be a public company to go accrual. I think most companies that are slightly more than individuals, most companies that are actual companies that have a lot of expenses or have expenses and have a team and have payroll and have taxes and have all that, they'll usually use accrual. I think we used accrual like almost right in the beginning, because it makes everything, it is a little bit more complicated. So you would need to have an accountant, and you don't want to do that by hand because that becomes a mess. But if you have an accountant, it shouldn't be that difficult if you don't have that many transactions. But the benefits are, one, you get to have a much better, more flexibility with your taxes, which hopefully none of you have to worry about it. But if you do have to worry about it, you want to have that sort of flexibility, especially when you make a lot of payments. So if you have a team and you're paying payroll taxes, if you have an office space, or you're buying a building, or you're doing any of those things that require big, larger amounts of cash, you want to be able to recognize them when they make the most sense for your books, as opposed to recognize them when they happen, because it doesn't always align. If you, for example, get paid by someone who's not directly from the App Store, so if you have accounts that pay you, let's say, for a year in advance, so an annual subscription even can be broken up. And if your fiscal year is not exactly the calendar year for that particular subscription, you don't have to pay taxes on that entire subscription. So on $100, you may only need to pay taxes in the current year on $50. Right. And as you grow, that becomes a lot more relevant. I don't even remember the days of doing cash basis. So I would say you don't have to be big to do it.
But it's so much easier. The other benefit too of accrual-based accounting is if you use your accounting data to run your business. So like, if you're trying to figure out, your ad spend in January was X and your revenue was Y, and you're trying to understand that at a, to the penny level, then doing accrual-based accounting, you can use your books to better like understand the ins and outs of the flow of money, and doing it in a way that's convenient to you versus just waiting until things get paid to register. And so that is one thing about cash-based accounting that is a downside. So for all the hassle of accrual-based accounting, you get more insight into what's actually going on with your business. So like when it says that in March I was paid X in my accounting software, I know that that money was not actually made in March. It's just that I was paid in March, and I don't use my books to analyze my business in that way. But if you're spending in January and you want to know how much revenue you actually generate in January, yeah, it does make sense. But because it's such a big hassle, it's like you need to at least be at the level where you can either hire an accountant or have somebody dedicate real time to it, because it's a lot of work, a lot of work.
Absolutely.
And then for all the reasons we just discussed, trying to align Apple's fiscal months to calendar months to do accrual-based accounting is a lot of work.
Yeah, you need a bookkeeper probably too, if you're in that boat and you want to do it right. I have to leave, but I think the next question, I think I can answer the next question.
Okay,
if you
go
want
for
me
it.
to.
Yeah.
So is it possible to get Apple to recharge a user after they've given the user a refund for a service they actually used? And the answer is no. I don't think anyone can make Apple do anything when it comes to subscriptions or in-app purchases or anything
Yep.
like that, which is why the new APIs that now Apple is starting to acquire, so you can enable people to do more about your subscription from within your app, why that's so exciting. You're kind of cutting out the whole, can Apple do this? Can Apple issue a refund? Can they undo a refund? And the answer is no to all of those. But
Yep.
now there's a little bit more access to users. On this happy note, I think my time is up. Is there anything
Awesome.
else I can answer quickly before I leave?
No, thank you so much. I'll go through these questions,
Awesome.
and then yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime too. And I'll come on one of your
Absolutely. I'd
chats,
love to
and
see you
we'll
on my side.
yeah, absolutely. But thank you so much for your
Sounds
time,
good.
Ariel, and thank you for going 30 minutes
Thank you for
over. It
having me on
is
this.
a big topic, so
Yeah,
a lot going on.
absolutely.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and if anyone has any questions that I can answer, you can find me on Twitter fairly easily. And a lot of people have my email at this point because I send a ton of newsletters. So if you want to ask me a question, I'll be on Twitter. Ask away. I'm pretty chatty, as you might imagine at this point.
Me too. All right, thanks so
Yeah,
much.
exactly.
Talk
All
to you
righty.
soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. All right. Well, he's leaving. I'll stick around and just try and get through all the questions. Glenn asks, I've read that some countries are requiring annual subscriptions to be refunded on a pro rata basis. How is this going to affect pricing versus monthly versus annual subscriptions now? This is a fascinating topic. The answer is it depends, and we don't know. It seems as though Apple is intentionally making it a little harder to get the prorated refund. And so then it just depends on, how many consumers actually jump through the hoops to get that prorated refund. And then I think it's going to matter too, kind of how much churn you have, how dependent you are on the annual subscriptions. And so I think the answer to this is going to vary depending on retention. I think if you look at a company like Netflix, where probably the majority of their customer base just stays subscribed, and like to me, it's just like I don't have cable anymore. I just subscribe to like 3 or 4 streaming services. I'm going to stay subscribed. I have no intention of ever canceling. And I'm not the kind of person that's going to cancel for a month and then get back on and then cancel and get back on, to save $10 here, $10 there. So I think, companies at that level are going to be much less impacted. And this is part, Netflix doesn't even offer an annual subscription anyway. But a lot of developers will charge 40 to 60% less on the annual subscription to make the pricing look very attractive compared to the monthly, to get that money up front, which is nice from a revenue standpoint, that you can pull that revenue forward. And then there is typically more monthly churn. So if you charge on a monthly basis, we're going to get some benchmarks out in the next few months, but by the end of a year, you generally have less than 50% on a monthly subscription, but you'll have in the ballpark of 50% on an annual subscription on the renewals. And so I think, there's a lot of kind of reasons why that is. People who are willing to pay the annual subscription probably have a little more dedication. People who are using the monthly subscription are maybe just wanting to try it out and pay the $5 or $10 or whatever your monthly subscription price is. So each app is going to have to figure out that balance, and they're going to have to look at how much better conversion are they getting by making the pricing look attractive for the annual. How important is having that revenue all at once versus over the months, and then look at once these things start to happen, our customers actually using it in mass. So if it's 5% of your annual subscriptions end up getting refunded, that's probably small enough that whatever was working for you on your annual versus monthly pricing is going to continue to work. So I kind of think it's not going to be a big deal and not going to change strategy very much. But again, there will be some apps, like if the app is heavily European focused versus the US, if like a lot of apps are like 60-70% US revenue. And so then if it's 5% of subscriptions get refunded, and that 5% is of 40% of your business, and it actually is just a few countries, it's not even all countries in Europe, and then globally. So, it may be 5% of 20% of your revenue. And so I kind of think it we'll see what happens, but I don't think it's kind of earth shattering and going to make big dramatic changes. Consumers are going to have to learn about it. They're going to have to jump through hoops to get the refunds. But ultimately, I think things like this are fantastic for the subscription economy broadly, because the more comfortable people are in the subscription model, the better off we all are. So yeah, we're going to, take a little bit of a hit when people do get that refund and Apple does pull the money out of your next payment. And for everything we were just discussing, it's going to be another kind of accounting nightmare, actually having to go into the payment reports and figure out these prorated refund amounts. So it is going to be a hassle, but ultimately I think it's fantastic for consumers to feel comfortable about signing up for an annual subscription. So broadly, I'm in favor. Yes, it's going to potentially change some tactics in some countries, depending on how much traction it gets. Jonathan says, so from our point of view, chargebacks and refunds look the same, and effect on cash flow timing would be equivalent whether they're talking chargeback or refund. Yes, that is correct. So they're essentially the same thing. And as with refunds, whenever the chargeback does happen, in the fiscal month that it happens is when they deduct the revenue. So, if something was a 3 or 4 month old transaction, and Apple will go back pretty far and offer a refund. As Ariel said, they fight chargebacks pretty hard, but if it's a refund from 3-4 months ago, it's going to come out of your next fiscal month's payment. Hope that answers that. Peter asked, how can a SaaS company recognize an Apple user initial subscription on a Google device or vice versa? So this is where RevenueCat comes in. Our platform is specifically designed to simplify the cross-platform subscription management. And so there's a couple of layers here. As I discussed earlier, we have the entitlement management of we're kind of the source of truth for who has access to what. And then we have what is now version 3, because we've learned so much. And as we've scaled and seen more kind of edge cases at scale, we've been able to tackle all known edge cases at this point. But by using RevenueCat and creating some form of customer ID, so if you collect an email on the web and then force them to log in on the device, if on Android you collect an email and a login or something like that, that's the most straightforward way to do it. If you don't want to force a login for the subscription, there's some kind of hacky ways around it where you could have them from the Android device push their anonymous ID and get access on an Apple device. And with the forthcoming RevenueCat Pay product that we're working on to make it easier to take web payments, we are working toward having a solution where you don't have to force a login, where they can pay on the web and be redirected to the app with that user ID intact. And then once that web payment is attached to that App Store account, then it stays with that account. So that kind of stuff does get really tricky, but again, it's why RevenueCat exists, is to help you manage those. And again, forcing a login is the easiest way to share subscriptions across platforms, but there are ways around it. Andrew asks, can you explain the anonymous user and alias in RevenueCat better for us? We have trouble keeping track of actual subscriber counts compared to the app platforms. Whew. This is, you know what, this is probably one better for the community or support. It's a long answer. The aliases and anonymous, you know, while you can, and I do this in my apps, using anonymous IDs does create some level of confusion, and this is where you know, kind of following on the last question, where our identity solution comes into play, is that there's even stuff, even if you have a login, where people share Apple IDs. So for a long time, like my wife and I shared an Apple ID, so I could pay for Calm and log in with my email address into Calm, and then my wife gets into Calm and she has my App Store receipt because she's logged into my App Store account. So Calm sees her as a valid subscriber, even though she's not logged into my account. And so those things get really, really tricky, especially because people do like to share Apple IDs so that they can get access to the paid versions. I mean, there's like you know, friend groups that will share an Apple ID so they can all get access. So so with RevenueCat, we do have a solution now in our identity management, where when you see multiple Apple IDs, when you see different login versus user ID, where you can decide to grant or revoke access and try and kind of prevent some of that. But when an Apple ID is shared and you're not requiring a login, so you have an anonymous user ID and you're relying 100% on the App Store receipt, you can end up with 10 or 20 people sharing the same subscription across multiple devices. And again, we have some tools in RevenueCat, you know, check our docs, talk to support. I'm not sure if this is answering your question specifically, but this is a better question for probably our the RevenueCat community, or talking to our support to get a little more detailed answer. But the broad answer is it's you know, it is a tough thing because people do try and work the system like that. Thomas asks, why do we some days get so many billing issues, mostly US and Australia? That is a great question. It's actually something I've been meaning to write a blog post on, just to force myself to ask the right people and get more detail on this. I know that there are specific countries that have higher billing issue rates. There's specific days that have higher billing issue rates. So, you know, for example, a lot of people get paid on a Friday. And so if they have a debit card attached to their App Store account, and you know, Thursday they've you know, hit a few dollars in their account and your subscription is 10, they're going to hit the billing issue if you're renewing on a Thursday. And then that's part of why Apple has the grace period now. So then if they get paid on a Friday, you know, they have the money, they want your subscription. I mean, ideally that's the case. I mean, you know, and so then on Friday, Apple retries and then the money's there. And then there's, you know, you can use app prepaid cards. Some people use prepaid cards to make sure that they don't spend too much. And so those prepaid cards can run out. There's a ton of different reasons why these billing issues happen. And at some point I want to do a deep dive on why, but that might actually answer your question, is that I would bet that if you are seeing an increase in the US and Australia of billing issues on specific days, I would bet it's either like a Thursday or a Friday, and it's because that's payday and the billing issues are happening to people who don't have the money in the account. All right, Leonard asks, we have a lot of 7-day trial users whose trials don't convert after 7 days, although they didn't opt out. Do you know why it sometimes takes longer for these trials to convert? So that's exactly, you know, well, part of what I was discussing earlier and part of what we discussed in the webinar. There are a certain percentage, and again, we should do benchmarks on this at some point on our website, on the blog, and we're working toward doing an annual report on these kind of benchmarks. But a surprising percentage of transactions, and again, don't quote me on these numbers, but it's in the ballpark of 20%. Probably somewhere in between 10 and 30%. And then it depends on the app. It depends on the geography. It depends on like so many different factors. And these are things that I would love to actually break down in a blog post. But those for not having funds in a debit card, for not having funds in a prepaid card, for expiration dates on a credit card, for fraud, mistaken fraud prevention. There's a ton of reasons why the initial transaction that Apple tries wouldn't go through. And so then that's why Apple has this grace period and these retry. And that's why you see a delay in those trial conversions, is that Apple's trying to collect, and actually Apple does a pretty incredible job. This is called dunning. You can look it up in the kind of SaaS industry, who's had to handle this on their own for years. And as an app developer, didn't even learn the word until a couple of years ago. But dunning is trying to collect payment. And so Apple has a pretty incredible process for continuing to retry those payments, entering into the grace period, continuing in that grace period to try payments. And they even do smart things like, trying on Fridays and Saturdays after payday and things like that. So that's why you have a lot of users who actually don't convert on that 7th day, is if the transaction enters into that grace period. All right, last question. I can't believe how many people are still here almost 2 hours in, but this has been so fun. And there's a reason this ended up being such a popular webinar, is that there's so much to talk about. The next question, can you talk in detail about cross-platform payment and how to manage it? I kind of went over that a little bit ago, kind of talking about billing on Stripe and Android, and again, we support the Amazon App Store. We're adding more web payments soon. Again, this is really why RevenueCat was built, was to manage this cross-platform payment. So the best place to read up on that, I think we have at least one blog post, and then we do talk about it quite a bit in the docs. So again, ideally, you would have a forced login for anybody who is going to pay. And then RevenueCat becomes that single source of truth across all the different platforms of who paid on the web, but is logging in on an Apple device, who paid on Android and is logging in on the web. And so, that is why RevenueCat exists, is to help simplify managing those cross-platform payments. And our identity solution can handle it, most seamlessly if you force some kind of login. But then we have ways to manage it through anonymous IDs and otherwise, if that's the route you go. All right. Now we had one more question come in. Hannah asks, where can I read more about the workflow for cross-platform payments? I kind of similar to what I just answered on the blog. And I feel like this webinar itself has asked a lot of questions that each individually should be blog posts. So we will do our best to be publishing more content in our docs, in the blog. As Ariel said, he'll probably have me on his, he does weekly tech talk kind of things. And so I guess the best thing for now is to follow me and Ariel on Twitter. And as we produce more content around this, we'll be sharing it. Subscribe to the RevenueCat newsletter, subscribe to the App Figures newsletter. And as we are able to both produce more content on understanding these things, and then also, provide more solutions. I was shocked to learn today, and I don't know if you'd want me to say publicly, but App Figures is a lot smaller than I thought it was. For as much as they've tackled and as much as they do, they're a relatively small company and bootstrapped. They've never taken funding. And so I won't say the exact number of employees in case Ariel didn't want me to say. And then Revenue Cat, we're 45 people now. We'll be probably, close to 100 in the next 12 months. But there's a lot of stuff that we still are in the process of building out to make these things easier and easier. And so we will continue working that direction. So follow me and Ariel for updates on better and better solutions for this. But again, for cross-platform payments specifically, we do have a lot of great tools with Stripe and Android, Amazon App Store, and Apple's App Store. And then feel free to hit me up too on Twitter as well. Whew, that was almost 2 hours. Thank you for the people who stuck around all the way to the end. And for asking so many interesting questions. And we'll have to do this again soon. Bye, y'all.